President Trump's temporary ban on refugee resettlement from 7 nations has ignited a firestorm of controversy on both sides of the border as Canada and the U.S. take opposing action on the issue. Although the ban is currently stayed, fear in the refugee and immigrant community has increased in the U.S., resulting in many making their way here on foot, suffering frostbite, and even some losing fingers and toes. One group of faith leaders in Minnesota have decided to do something about it, joining together to provide sanctuary to immigrants seeking refuge. JANAE Bates joins us to tell us more. JANAE, thanks for joining me.
Thank you for having me.
So tell me about the Isaiah Network and what you're trying to do in response to the refugee ban.
Sure. Isaiah is a coalition of about 100 congregations here in Minnesota that come together to fight for racial and economic justice. And so, what we've been doing is a number of different things in regards to refugees and immigrants here, specifically undocumented immigrants. And we have created a sanctuary network in Minnesota.
So now, what does that mean, sanctuary? Is that a long-term plan? People can stay in your churches? Is that what that means?
That is essentially what it means, because there's quite a bit of unknown about what is going to happen in regard to the immigrant community here. But what we do know is that there's been immense amount of fear. There has been a huge hate rhetoric and mentality unleashed in our country around the immigrant population, and this is a really vulnerable community. And so, essentially, they will be able to live within the space of places of worship for however long it takes to get them a stay of removal.
So I know that you have churches that are supporting sanctuary churches, and then there are churches actually going to let people live there. How are you going to screen? Because really the root of this refugee issue is fear of terrorism, fear of criminals or unsavory people being able to stay in Canada or the U.S. So how are you going to address that?
Yeah, sure. So there are two major ways that people usually get deported here in the US. One is like the most commonly known, which is a raid. And generally, the way that that tends to happen is ICE or immigration customs law enforcement. They come and they will come to a place of employment or a community that is heavily populated with immigrants, and it'll just be one fell swoop. They'll take everyone. In those cases, it's really unlikely for us to be able to put anyone into sanctuary. Those who would be most likely in sanctuary are people who are in the process of trying to stay in the U.S. legally. The U.S. has a very broken immigration system that makes it extremely difficult and really complicated in order to be able to live here legally if you weren't born here. And so, what tends to happen is that they go through this very long process through, a bunch of bureaucracy in order to live here, meaning that the government has all of their information. They do very full and complex background checks, and then usually once they're denied, and it's not because of some criminal in the sense that we tend to imagine what criminal means. It just means that you've crossed the border undocumented, and so once they do that and then start that process, usually they end up denied for a stay here. And so those would usually, for Isaiah's standpoint, those would tend to be the people who are most likely to be put in sanctuary. We do have like a protocol screening because we're working with immigrant advocacy groups and law firms here in Minnesota, and so it's certainly ways to keep everyone safe, including our congregations that are doing this. But we definitely have a priority of the most vulnerable, which would be our immigrant population when
And
we're talking about this.
and as a follower of Jesus and a faith group, why do you believe it's important that you become involved in this issue, even so much as allowing people to live in your churches?
I think that it's immensely important that Christians get involved in this. If if we, this we were called for this, to be quite honest. Our scripture is very clear about welcoming the stranger, treating the foreigner as ourselves, treating them as native. And so we can't ignore our holy text that declares us to do this. Also, Christ was one of the most welcoming to those who were considered to be lowly or less than in community. And so to me, this was a very easy and not easy, let me rephrase. It was a very um, obvious answer. There's certainly a lot of complexities around it and legitimate concerns, but at the same time, this is what faith is, the substance of things hoped for and the evidence of the unseen. And so we know there's a lot of we don't know, but what we do know is that we're following what God calls us to.
We only have 30 seconds left, but I just would like you to address the
Yeah.
fear issue, because I think that a lot of people are just worried. They don't want to be unwelcoming to the foreigner, but they're just worried about safety and the safety of our borders. Can you just address that quickly?
Yeah, I think we also need to be really concerned about the fear that these targeted communities are experiencing. Like we may be afraid for, whatever man can do to us, but there is quite a bit of just like very targeted hate to people who are just trying to survive. And so we need to be concerned about their fear as well.
That's a really good point. JANAE, thank you so much for joining us, and we'll keep people updated on what's happening as these things develop.
Thank you.
Okay, bye-bye. We'll go over